There was a figure on the beach a few hundred meters away, on Vega. At first she thought it was Vega, perhaps out of the examining room early, and come to tell her the good news. But whoever it was wasn't wearing a machine project jumpsuit. Also, it seemed to be someone younger, more vigorous. She reached for the long lens and for some reason hesitated. Standing up, she shielded her eyes from the sun. Just for a moment, it had seemed it was clearly impossible. They would not take such shameless advantage of her. But she could not help herself. She was racing toward him on the hard sand near the water's edge, her hair streaming behind her. He looked as he had in the most recent picture of him she had seen, vigorous, happy. He had a day's growth of beard, and she flew into his arms, sobbing. "Hello, Presh," he said, his right hand stroking the back of her head. His voice was right. She instantly remembered it. And his smell, his gait, his laugh, the way his beard abraded her cheek, all of it combined to shatter her self-possession. She could feel a massive stone seal being pried open, and the first rays of light entering an ancient, almost forgotten tomb. She swallowed and tried to gain control of herself, but seemingly inexhaustible waves of anguish poured out of her, and she would weep again. He stood there patiently, reassuring her with the same look she now remembered he had given her from his post at the bottom of the staircase during his first solo journey down the big steps. More than anything else, she had longed to see him again, but she had suppressed the feeling, been impatient with it, because it was so clearly impossible to fulfill. She cried for all the years between herself and him. In her girlhood and as a young woman, she would dream that he had come to her to tell her that his death had been a mistake. He was really fine. He would sweep her up into his arms, but she would pay for those brief respites with poignant reawakenings into a world in which he no longer was. Still, she had cherished those dreams and willingly paid their exorbitant tariff when the next morning she was forced to rediscover her loss and experience the agony again. Those phantom moments were all she had left of him. And now here he was, not a dream or a ghost, but flesh and blood, or close enough. He had called to her from the stars, and she had come. She hugged him with all her might. She knew it was a trick, a reconstruction, a simulation, but it was flawless. For a moment she held him by the shoulders at arm's length. He was perfect. It was as if her father had these many years ago died and gone to heaven, and finally by his unorthodox route, she had managed to rejoin him. She sobbed and embraced him again. It took her another minute to compose herself. If it had been Ken, say, she would have at least toyed with the idea that another dodecahedron, maybe a repaired Soviet machine, had made a later relay from the Earth to the center of the galaxy. But not for a moment could such a possibility be entertained for him. His remains were decaying in a cemetery by a lake. She wiped her eyes, laughing and crying at once. So, what do I owe the apparition to? Robotics or hypnosis? Am I an artifact or a dream? You might ask that about anything. Even today, not a week goes by when I don't think that I'd give anything I had just to spend a few minutes with my father again. Well, here I am, his hands raised, making a half-turn so she could be sure that the back of him was there as well. But he was so young, younger surely than she. He had been only 36 when he died. Maybe this was their way of calming her fears. If so, they were very thoughtful. She guided him back toward her few possessions, her arm around his waist. He certainly felt substantial enough. If there were gear trains and integrated circuits underneath his skin, they were well hidden. "So how are we doing?" she asked. The question was ambiguous. I know. It took you many years from receipt of the message to your arrival here. Do you grade on speed or accuracy? Neither. You mean we haven't completed the test yet? He did not answer. Well, explain it to me, she said, this in some distress. Some of us has spent years decrypting the message and building the machine. Aren't you going to tell me what it's all about? You become a real scrapper, he said, as if he really were her father, as if he were comparing his last recollections of her with her present, still incompletely developed self. He gave her hair an affectionate tousle. She remembered that from her childhood also. But how could they, 30,000 light years from Earth, know her father's affectionate gestures in long ago and faraway Wisconsin? Suddenly she knew. Dreams, she said. Last night, when we were all dreaming, you were inside our heads, right? You drained everything we know. We only made copies. I think everything that used to be in your head is still there. Take a look. Tell me if anything's missing, he grinned and went on. There was so much your television programs didn't tell us. Oh, we could figure out your technological level pretty well, and a lot more about you, but there's so much more to your species than that. Things we couldn't possibly learn indirectly. I recognize you may feel some breach of privacy. You're joking. But we have so little time. You mean the test is over? We answered all your questions while we were asleep last night. So, did we pass or fail? It isn't like that, he said. It isn't like 6th grade. She had been in the 6th grade the year he died. Don't think of us as some interstellar sheriff gunning down outlaw civilizations. Think of us more as the office of the galactic consensus. We collect information. I know you think nobody has anything to learn from you because you're technologically so backward, but there are other merits to a civilization. What merits? Oh, music, loving kindness. I like that word. Dreams. Humans are very good at dreaming, although you'd never know it from your television. There are cultures all over the galaxy that trade dreams. You operate an interstellar cultural exchange? That's what this is all about? You don't care if some rapacious, bloodthirsty civilization develops interstellar spaceflight? I said we admire loving kindness. If the Nazis had taken over the world, our world, and then developed interstellar spaceflight, wouldn't you have stepped in? You'd be surprised how rarely something like that happens. In the long run, the aggressive civilizations destroy themselves, almost always. It's their nature. They can't help it. In such a case, our job would be to leave them alone, to make sure that no one bothers them, to let them work out their own destiny. Then why didn't you leave us alone? I'm not complaining, mind you. I'm only curious as to how the office of the galactic consensus works. The first thing you picked up from us was that Hitler broadcast. Why did you make contact? The picture, of course, was alarming. We could tell you were in deep trouble. But the music told us something else. The Beethoven told us there was hope. Marginal cases are our specialty. We thought you could use a little help. Really, we can offer only a little. You understand. There are certain limitations imposed by casualty. He had crouched down, running his hands through the water, and was now drying them on his pants. Last night, we looked inside you, all 5 of you. There's a lot in there. Feelings, memories, instincts, learned behavior, insights, madness, dreams, loves. Love is very important. You're an interesting mix. All that in one night's work? She was taunting him a little. We had to hurry. We have a pretty tight schedule. Why? Is something about to... No, it's just that if we don't engineer a consistent casualty, it'll work itself out on its own. Then it's almost always worse. She had no idea what he meant. Engineer a consistent casualty. My dad never used to talk like that. Certainly he did. Don't you remember how he spoke to you? He was a well-read man, and from when you were a little girl, I, talked to you as an equal. Don't you remember? She remembered. She remembered. She thought of her mother in the nursing home. What a nice pendant, he said, with just the air of fatherly reserve she had always imagined he would have cultivated had he lived to see her adolescence. Who gave it to you? Oh, this? She said, fingering the medallion. Actually, it's from somebody I don't know very well. He tested my faith. But you must know this already. Again, the grin. I want to know what you think of us, she said shortly. What you really think of humans. He did not hesitate for a moment. All right. I think it's amazing that you've done as well as you have. You've got hardly any theory of social organization, astonishingly backward economic systems, no grasp of the machinery of historical prediction, and very little knowledge about yourselves. Considering how fast your world is changing, it's amazing you haven't blown yourselves to bits by now. That's why we don't want to write you off just yet. You humans have a certain talent for adaptability, at least in the short term. That's the issue, isn't it? That's one issue. You can see that after a while, the civilizations with only short-term perspectives just aren't around. They work out their destinies also. She wanted to ask him how he honestly felt about humans. Curiosity, compassion, no feelings, whatever. Just all in a day's work. In his heart of hearts, or whatever equivalent internal organs he possessed, did he think of her as she thought of an aunt? But she could not bring herself to raise the question. She was too much afraid of the answer. From the intonation of his voice, from the nuances of his speech, she tried to gain some glimpse of who it was here disguised as her father. She had an enormous amount of direct experience with human beings. Station masters had less than a day's. Could she not discern something of their true nature beneath this amiable and informative facade? But she couldn't. In the content of his speech, he was, of course, not her father, nor did he pretend to be. But in every other aspect, he was uncannily close to Theodore F. Arroway, 1924 through 1960, vendor of hardware, loving husband and father. If not for a continuous effort of will, she knew she would be slobbering over this copy. Part of her kept wanting to ask him how things had been since he had gone to heaven. What were his views on Advent and rapture? What was anything special in the works for the millennium? There were human cultures that taught an afterlife of the blessed on mountaintops or in clouds, in caverns or oases, but she could not recall any in which you were very, very, very good when you died, you went to the beach. Do we have time for some questions before whatever it is we have to do next? Sure, one or two anyway. Tell me about your transportation system. I can do better than that, he said. I can show you. Steady now. An amoeba of blackness leaked out from the zenith, obscuring sun and blue sky. That's quite a trick, she gasped. The same sandy beach was beneath her feet. She dug her toes in. Overhead was the cosmos. They were, it seemed, high above the Milky Way galaxy, looking down on its spiral structure and falling towards it at some impossible speed. He explained matter-of-factly, using her own familiar scientific language to describe the vast pinwheel-shaped structure. He showed her the Orion spiral arm, in which the sun was in this epoch embedded, interior to it. In decreasing order of mythological significance were the Sagittarius arm, the Norma Sanctum arm, and the 3 kiloparsec arm. A network of straight lines appeared, representing the transportation system they had used. It was like the illuminated maps in the Paris metro. Ida had been right. Each station, she deduced, was in a star system with a low-mass double black hole. She knew the black holes couldn't have resulted from stellar collapse, from the normal evolution of massive star systems, because they were too small. Maybe they were primordial, left over from the Big Bang, captured by some unimaginable starship and towed to their designated station. Or maybe they were made from scratch. She wanted to ask about this, but the tour was pressing breathlessly onward. There was a disk of glowing hydrogen rotating about the center of the galaxy, and within it a ring of molecular clouds rushing outward towards the periphery of the Milky Way. He showed her the ordered motions in the giant molecular cloud complex Sagittarius B2, which had for decades been a favorite hunting ground for complex organic molecules by her radio-astronomical colleagues on Earth. Closer to the center, they encountered another giant molecular cloud, and then Sagittarius A West, an intense radio source that Ellie herself had observed at Argus. And just adjacent, at the very center of the galaxy, locked in a passionate gravitational embrace, was a pair of immense black holes. The mass of one of them was 5 million suns. Rivers of gas the size of solar systems were pouring down its maw. Too colossal, she ruminated on the limitations of the languages of Earth. Two supermassive black holes are orbiting one another at the center of the galaxy. One had been known, or at least strongly suspected. But two? Shouldn't that have been shown up as a Doppler displacement of spectral lines? She imagined a sign under one of them reading entrance, and under the other exit. And at the moment, the entrance was in use. The exit was merely there. And that was where this station, Grand Central Station, was. Just safely outside the black holes at the center of the galaxy. The skies were made brilliant by millions of nearby young stars, but the stars, the gas, and the dust were being eaten up by the entrance black hole. "It goes somewhere, right?" she asked. "Oh, of course. Can you tell me where?" "Sure. All this stuff winds up in Cygnus A." Cygnus A was something she knew about, except only for a nearby supernova remnant in Cassiopeia. It was the brightest radio source in the skies of Earth. She had calculated that in 1 second, Cygnus A produces more energy than the sun does in 40,000 years. The radio source was 600 million light years away, far beyond the Milky Way, out in the realm of the galaxies. As with many extragalactic radio sources, two enormous jets of gas, fleeting apart at almost the speed of light, were making a complex web of raking Huguenot shock fronts with the thin intergalactic gas, and producing in the process a radio beacon that shone brightly over most of the universe. All the matter in this enormous structure, 50,000 light-years across, was pouring out of a tiny, almost inconspicuous point in space exactly midway between the jets. "You're making Cygnus A?" She half remembered a summer's night in Michigan when she was a girl. She had feared she would fall into the sky. "Oh, it's not just us. This is a cooperative project of many galaxies. That's what we mainly do. Engineering. Only a few of us are involved with emerging civilizations." At each pause, she had felt a kind of tingling in her head, approximately in the left parietal lobe. "There are cooperative projects between galaxies?" she asked. "Lots of galaxies, each with a kind of central administration, with hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy, and then those administrations cooperate to pour millions of suns into Centaurus? Sorry, Cygnus A? Forgive me, I'm just staggered by the scale of it all. Why would you do all this? Whatever for?" "You mustn't think of the universe as a wilderness. It hasn't been that for billions of years," he said. "Think of it as more as cultivated." Again, a tingling. But for what? What's there to cultivate? The basic problem is easily stated. Now don't get scared off by the scale. You're an astronomer, after all. The problem is that the universe is expanding, and there's not enough matter in it to stop the expansion. After a while, no new galaxies, no new stars, no new planets, no newly arisen life forms, just the same old crowd. Everything's getting run down. It'll be boring. So, in Cygnus A, we're testing out the technology to make something new. You might call it an experiment, an urban renewal. It's not our only trial run. Sometime later, we might want to close off a piece of the universe and prevent space from getting more and more empty as the eons pass. Increasing the local matter density's the way to do it, of course. It's good, honest work. Like running a hardware store in Wisconsin. If Cygnus A was 600 million light years away, then astronomers on Earth, or anywhere in the Milky Way for that matter, were seeing it as if it had been 600 million years ago. But on Earth 600 million years ago, she knew there had hardly been any life, even in the oceans, big enough to shake a stick at. They were old. 600 million years ago on a beach like this one, except no crabs, no gulls, no palm trees. She tried to imagine some microscopic plant washed ashore, securing a tremulous toehold just above the waterline, while these beings were occupied with experimental galactogenesis and introductory cosmic engineering. You've been pouring matter into Cygnus A for the last 600 million years. Well, what you've detected by radio astronomy was just some of our early feasibility testing. We're much further along now. And in due course, in another few 100 million years, she imagined, radio astronomers on Earth, if any, will detect substantial progress in the reconstruction of the universe around Cygnus A. She steeled herself for further revelations and vowed she would not let them intimidate her. There was a hierarchy of beings on a scale she had not imagined, but the Earth had a place, a significance in that hierarchy. They would not have gone to all this trouble for nothing. The blackness rushed back to the zenith and was consumed. Sun and blue sky returned. The scene was the same: surf, sand, palms. Magritte door, micro camera, Frond, and her father. Those moving interstellar clouds and rings near the center of the galaxy, aren't they due to periodic explosions around here? Isn't it dangerous to locate the station here? Episodic, not periodic. It only happens on a small scale. Nothing like the sort of thing we're doing in Cygnus A. And it's manageable. We know when it's coming and we generally just hunker down, if it's really dangerous. We take the station somewhere else for a while. This is all routine, you understand. Of course, routine. You built it all. The subways, I mean, you and those other engineers from other galaxies? Oh no, we haven't built any of it. I've missed something. Help me understand? It seems to be the same everywhere. In our case, we emerged a long time ago on many different worlds in the Milky Way. The first of us developed interstellar spaceflight and eventually chanced on one of the transit stations. Of course, we didn't know what it was. We weren't even sure it was artificial until the first of us were brave enough to slide down. Who's we? You mean the ancestors of your race, your species? No. We're many species from many worlds. Eventually, we found a large number of subways, various ages, various styles of ornamentation, and all abandoned. Most were still in good working condition. All we did was make some repairs and improvements. No other artifacts, no dead cities, no records of what happened, no subway builders left? He shook his head. No industrialized, abandoned planets? He repeated the gesture. There was a galaxy-wide civilization that picked up and left without leaving a trace, except for the stations. That's more or less right, and it's the same in other galaxies also. Billions of years ago, they all went somewhere. We haven't the slightest idea where. But where could they go? He shook his head for the third time, but now very slowly. So then you're not... No, we're just caretakers, he said. Maybe someday they'll come back. Okay, just one more, she pleaded, holding her index finger up before her as probably had been her practice at age 2. One more question. All right, he answered tolerantly, but we only have a few minutes left. She glanced at the doorway again and suppressed a tremor as the small, almost transparent crab slided by. I want to know about your myths, your religions. What fills you with awe? Or are those who make the numinous unable to feel it? Will you make the numinous also? No, I know what you're asking. Certainly, we feel it. You recognize that some of this is hard for me to communicate to you, but I'll give you an example of what you're asking for. I don't say this is it exactly, but it'll give you a... He paused momentarily, and again she felt a tingle, this time in her left occipital lobe. She entertained the notion that he was rifling through her neurons. Had he missed something last night? If so, she was glad. It meant they weren't perfect. Flavor of our numinous, it concerns pi, the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. You know it well, of course, and you also know you can never come to the end of pi. There's no creature in the universe, no matter how smart, who could calculate pi to the last digit, because there is no last digit, only an infinite number of digits. Your mathematicians have made an effort to calculate it out to... Again, she felt the tingle. None of you seem to know. Let's say the 10 billionth place. You won't be surprised to hear that other mathematicians have gone further. Well, eventually, let's say it's in the 10th to the 20th power place. Something happens. The randomly varying digits disappear, and for an unbelievably long time, there's nothing but ones and zeros. Idly, he was tracing a circle out of the sand with his toe. She paused, a heartbeat before replying. And the zeros and ones finally stop? You get back to a random sequence of digits? Seeing a faint sign of encouragement from him, she raced on. And the number of zeros and ones, is it a product of prime numbers? Yes, 11 of them. You're telling me there's a message in 11 dimensions hidden deep inside the number pi? Someone in the universe communicates by mathematics? But help me, I'm really having trouble understanding you. Mathematics isn't arbitrary. I mean, pi has to have the same value everywhere. How can you hide a message inside pi? It's built into the fabric of the universe. Exactly. She stared at him. It's even better than that, he continued. Let's assume that only in base 10 arithmetic does the sequence of zeros and ones show up, although you'd recognize that something's funny going on in any other arithmetic. Let's also assume that the beings who first made this discovery had 10 fingers. You see how it looks? It's as if pi has been waiting for billions of years for 10-fingered mathematicians with fast computers to come along. You see, the message was kind of addressed to us. But this is just a metaphor, right? It's not really pi, and then the 10 to the 20th place. You don't actually have 10 fingers. Well, not really, he smiled at her again. Well, for heaven's sake, what does the message say? He paused for a moment, raised an index finger. and then pointed to the door. She looked around her. The station masters had produced for each of the 5 humans what could only be described as their deepest loves. Perhaps it was only to erase the barriers of communication with another, appallingly different species. She was glad none of them were happily chatting with an exact copy of themselves. What if you could do this back on Earth, she wondered. What if, despite all our pretense and disguise, it was necessary to appear in public with the person we loved most of all? Imagine this a prerequisite for social discourse on Earth. It would change everything. She imagined a phalanx of members of one sex surrounding a solitary member of the other, or chains of people, circles, the letters H or Q, lazy figure eights. You could monitor deep affections at a glance just by looking at the geometry, a kind of general relativity applied to social psychology. The practical difficulties of such an arrangement would be considerable, but no one would be able to lie about love. The caretakers were in a polite but determined hurry. There was not much time to talk. The entrance to the airlock of the decahedron was now visible, roughly where it had been when they first arrived. By symmetry, or perhaps because of some interdimensional conservation law, the Marguerite doorway had vanished. They introduced everyone. She felt silly in more ways than one, explaining in English to the Emperor Quint who her father was, but she dutifully translated, and they all solemnly shook hands as if they were their first encounter, perhaps at a suburban barbecue. Ida's wife was a considerable beauty, and Surrender Ghosh was giving her a more than casual inspection. And Devi did not seem to mind. Perhaps she was merely gratified at the accuracy of the imposture. "Where did you go when you stepped through the doorway?" Ellie softly asked her. 416 Maiden Hall Way, she answered. Ellie looked at her blankly. London, 1973? With Surrendar? She nodded her head in his direction. Before he died. Ellie wondered what she would have found had she crossed that threshold on the beach. Wisconsin, in the late 50s, perhaps? She hadn't shown up on schedule, so he had come to find her. He had done that in Wisconsin more than once. Ida had also been told about a message deep inside a transcendental number. But in his story, it was not pi, the base of natural logarithms, but a class of numbers she had never heard of, with an infinity of transcendental numbers. They would never know for sure which number to examine back on Earth. "I hungered to stay and work on it," he told Ellie softly, "and I sensed they needed help. Some way of thinking about cipherment that hadn't occurred to them, but I think it's something very personal for them. They don't want to share it with others. And realistically, I suppose we just aren't smart enough to give them a hand." They hadn't decrypted the message in pi? The station masters, the caretakers, the designers of new galaxies hadn't figured out a message that had been sitting under their thumbs for a galactic rotation or two? Was the message that difficult, or were they... "Time to go home," her father said gently. It was wrenching. She didn't want to go. She tried staring at the palm frond. She tried asking more questions. "How do you mean go home? You mean we're going to emerge somewhere in the solar system? How will we get down to Earth?" "You'll see," he answered. "It'll be interesting." He put his arm around her waist, guiding her towards the open airlock door. It was like bedtime. You could be cute. You could ask bright questions, and maybe they'd let you stay up a little later. It used to work. At least a little. "The Earth is linked up now, right? Both ways. If we can go home, you can come down to us in a jiffy, you know? That makes me awfully nervous. Why don't you just sever the link? We'll take it from here." "Sorry, Presh," he replied, as if she had already shamelessly prolonged her 8 o'clock bedtime. Was he sorry about bedtime, or about being unready to denozzle the tunnel? "For a while, at least, it'll be open only to inbound traffic," he said, "but we don't expect to use it." She liked the isolation of the Earth from Vega. She preferred a 52-year-long leeway between unacceptable behavior on Earth and the arrival of a punitive expedition. The black hole link was uncomfortable. They could arrive almost instantaneously, perhaps only in Hakokato, perhaps anywhere on Earth. It was a transition to what Hayden had called micro-intervention. No matter what assurances they gave, they would watch us more closely now. No more dropping in for a casual look-see every few million years. She explored her discomfort further. How theological the circumstances had become. Here were beings who live in the sky, beings enormously knowledgeable and powerful, beings concerned for our survival, beings with a set of expectations about how we should behave. They disclaimed such a role, but they could clearly visit reward and punishment, life and death on the puny inhabitants of Earth. Now, how is this different, she asked herself, from the old-time religion? The answer occurred to her instantaneously. It was a matter of evidence. In her videotapes, in the data the others had acquired, there would be hard evidence of the existence of the station, of what went on here, of the black hole transit system. There would be 5 independent, mutually corroborative stories, supported by compelling physical evidence. This was fact, not hearsay and hocus pocus. She turned towards him and dropped the frown. Wordlessly, he stooped and returned it to her. You've been very generous in answering all my questions. Can I answer any for you? Thanks. You answered all our questions last night. That's it? No commandments, no instructions for the provincials? It doesn't work that way, Presh. You've grown up now. You're on your own. He tilted his head, gave her that grin, and she flew into his arms. Her eyes again filling with tears. It was a long embrace. Eventually, she felt him gently disengage her arms. It was time to go to bed. She imagined holding up her index finger and asking for still 1 more minute, but she did not want to disappoint him. Bye, Presh, he said. Give your mother my love. Take care, she replied in a small voice. She took one last look at the seashore at the center of the galaxy. A pair of seabirds, petrels perhaps, were suspended on some rising column of air. They remained aloft with hardly a beat of their wings. Just at the entrance to the airlock, she turned and called to him. What does your message say, the one in Pi? We don't know, he replied a little sadly, taking a few steps towards her. Maybe it's a kind of statistical accident. We're still working on it. The breeze stirred up, tousling her hair once again. Well, give us a call when you figure it out, Ellie said.